Hey guys, tonight we're stepping into a medieval stone chapel where the air hangs thick with an odour you'd never expect at a wedding. You stand near the back, watching a bride process down the narrow aisle, and instead of clutching a bouquet of roses or lilies, her trembling hands grip clusters of raw garlic bulbs. The papery white skins catch the flicker of tallow candles, and the sharp, pungent smell cuts through the mustiness of centuries-old stone. Her veil is simple linen. Her dress is wool dyed an expensive saffron yellow, and woven into her braided hair are more cloves of garlic. Small, pale talismans against forces you can't see, but that everyone in this room believes are watching, waiting, circling. The story may solve mysteries you never had an explanation for, like why your grandmother insisted on certain rituals, or why garlic appears in so many folklore traditions across cultures that never contacted each other. So, before you explore the story with me, please take a moment to help me subscribe to the channel, like and share this video, or maybe leave a comment below. But make sure you do it when you really like what I bring to you. Tell me where you're watching from tonight. Whether you're tucked into bed in Toronto, or winding down after a long shift in Manila. Maybe let me know if you've ever encountered strange wedding traditions in your own family that nobody could quite explain. These little connections matter, and they help this channel grow into a community of curious minds who love the odd corners of history. Now, let's keep the lights as soft as possible. Turn on the fan for a gentle sound to help the story feel more emotional, and let's embark on tonight's journey together. You're standing in this chapel somewhere in the English Midlands, perhaps in the year 1347, though the exact date doesn't matter because this scene repeats itself across decades, across borders, across the entire medieval period. The groom shifts his weight from foot to foot near the altar, and you notice he's wearing a small pouch around his neck. Inside it, more garlic, along with a snippet of iron, and perhaps a saint's relic if his family could afford one. The priest, his face weathered and patient, holds a Bible in one hand and doesn't even wrinkle his nose at the overwhelming smell. He's used to it. Every wedding he's performed this year has featured garlic in some form. It's not fashion. It's not a charming rustic custom. It's necessity. You see, medieval people understood their world through a lens we've almost completely lost. A lens where the invisible realm pressed constantly against the visible one, where the boundary between the living and the supernatural was as thin as morning mist, and where certain moments in life tore that boundary wide open. A wedding was one of those moments. Marriage represented transition, transformation, the movement from one state of being to another, and in that liminal space, malevolent forces could slip through. A bride was particularly vulnerable because she was leaving her father's household, abandoning the protection of her childhood home, stepping away from familiar guardian spirits, and entering territory, both physical and spiritual, that didn't yet recognize her. She was, in essence, unprotected. The garlic she carries isn't decorative. It's a weapon. It's a shield. It's insurance against catastrophe that everyone in this room believes could strike at any second. The guests seated on rough wooden benches, her family on one side, his on the other. Many of them are wearing garlic too, tucked into sleeves, tied around wrists with red thread, crushed and rubbed onto skin. The children don't giggle about it. Nobody finds it strange. This is simply what you do when you want a marriage to survive not just the social and economic challenges ahead, but the supernatural gauntlet of the wedding day itself. Historians still argue whether medieval people genuinely believed in demonic interference at weddings, or whether these practices were simply inherited traditions performed without deep conviction, the way we might throw rice or avoid breaking mirrors without really believing in the consequences. But the written records, church documents, personal letters, local court cases about witchcraft suggest the belief was genuine, visceral, and widespread across social classes. A 15th century English housekeeping manual casually instructs brides to wear garlic against spirits that envy joy, as matter-of-factly as it discusses how to salt meat for winter. You watch the ceremony proceed. The priest begins the Latin prayers, words most people here don't understand but trust carry power. The bride and groom exchange their vows, and at the moment they clasp hands, an older woman near the front, probably the bride's mother, clutches her own garlic bundle tighter, lips moving in silent prayer. This is the most dangerous instant, the moment of commitment, the forging of new bonds, the severing of old ones. If evil wanted to strike, it would be now. But nothing visible happens. No thunder crashes. No cold wind extinguishes the candles. The ceremony continues, and after the final blessing, the couple processes back down the aisle, and you notice someone has scattered more garlic cloves across the threshold of the church door. The bride must step over them, bringing her feet down carefully on the worn stones, carrying her protection with her as she moves from sacred space into the village street beyond. Outside, the afternoon sun feels too bright after the chapel's dimness. The wedding party begins the walk to the feast, and you trail behind, watching how the bride never releases her garlic, how it's become almost an extension of her hands. You wonder what it feels like to be her, 19 years old perhaps, entering a marriage arranged by her father to a man she's met 3 times, moving to a household where she'll be the lowest-ranking woman beneath her new mother-in-law, and believing with every fibre of her being that invisible demons want to destroy her happiness, invade her body, or curse her womb to barrenness. The garlic is the only thing standing between her and those horrors. Of course she clutches it. Of course she doesn't let go. This is where our journey begins tonight, at the intersection of love and terror, celebration and supernatural dread, where one of humanity's most common ceremonies becomes a battlefield against invisible forces, and where a simple kitchen herb transforms into the most important object a bride could carry. We're going to explore why this happened, how it happened, what it meant to the people living through it, and how whispers of these beliefs still echo in wedding traditions today, hidden in plain sight, waiting for someone to notice and ask why. You watch the newlyweds walk toward the manor house where the feast will be held, and you need to understand something crucial. This marriage has almost nothing to do with love. The bride met her groom 3 times before today, always under supervision, always with family members negotiating in hushed corners, while the young couple exchanged awkward pleasantries over weak ale. Her father is a wool merchant with declining fortunes and 3 more daughters to marry off. The groom's family owns land, not vast estates, but enough arable fields to generate steady income, plus a mill that grinds grain for surrounding villages. This wedding is a business merger dressed in ceremony, a contract sealed with vows instead of signatures, and the garlic the bride carries protects not romantic love but economic investment. Medieval marriage was transactional in ways that make modern prenuptial agreements look casual. You sit at the edge of the negotiations that happened 3 months ago in the bride's father's hall, watching her mother serve honeyed wine while the men discussed terms. The dowry her father offered included 20 silver marks, a dozen yards of Flemish cloth, 2 breeding ewes, and a promise of future trading connections in London. The groom's family countered with guarantees about the bride's position in their household, access to a private chamber after the first year, and inheritance rights for any sons she produced. Everything was calculated, weighed, negotiated with the same energy merchants used to debate wool prices. The bride herself sat in the corner during these negotiations, embroidering, saying nothing because her opinion wasn't requested. She's known since childhood that marriage was her destiny and her duty, the only respectable path for a woman of her station who didn't enter a convent. Her education consisted of learning to manage servants, keep household accounts, preserve food, brew ale, and produce children who survived infancy. Romance wasn't part of the curriculum. Compatibility wasn't discussed. Her father chose a family on the rise with resources and reputation, and her feelings about the arrangement mattered less than the colour of thread in her embroidery. This transactional nature made the supernatural protection even more critical. If a marriage was essentially a business deal between families, then demons didn't just threaten the couple's happiness, they threatened property transfers, inheritance lines, economic alliances, and social standing. A cursed bride who couldn't produce children represented catastrophic financial loss. A possessed groom who went mad or died young meant wasted dowries and broken contracts. The garlic wasn't protecting romance, it was protecting investment portfolios measured in livestock and land deeds. Historians still argue whether this purely economic view of medieval marriage is overstated, whether affection and companionship did develop between couples despite the transactional origins, but the documentary evidence from the period focuses relentlessly on property and bloodlines. Love poetry existed, certainly. Troubadours sang of passionate devotion, but those songs described relationships outside marriage, often adulterous affairs between knights and noblewomen. Marriage itself was too important for something as unreliable as emotion. You notice the groom's father walking beside the priest, and you catch fragments of their conversation. They're discussing the bride's childbearing potential. Her hips are wide, which is favourable, and her mother bore 6 children, 5 of whom survived past age 3, which suggests good stock. The bride's menstrual cycles have been documented and shared with the groom's family. Her teeth were examined before negotiations concluded. This isn't cruelty, it's due diligence. Marriage in 1347 is deadly serious business where fortunes rise and fall based on fertility, where family lines continue or die out, where property consolidates or fragments based on whether this young woman can successfully produce male heirs. The bride's mother walks close to her daughter, occasionally reaching out to touch the garlic the girl carries, reinforcing its protective power through contact. She knows what her daughter faces. The mother herself was married at 17 to a man 20 years older, moved into a household where her mother-in-law controlled every key and questioned every decision, and spent her first 5 years proving her worth through successful pregnancies. She remembers the terror of those early months, the loneliness, the constant scrutiny, and she knows demons aren't the only dangers her daughter will face, but they're the ones garlic might actually help with. The wedding party passes through the village, and you see other women watching from doorways, some pregnant, some carrying infants, some alone because their husbands died in the last outbreak of fever. Marriage for them wasn't an escape or a romance, it was economic survival. An unmarried woman had almost no legal standing, couldn't own property in her own name, couldn't enter most trades, couldn't live alone without inviting scandal and suspicion. Marriage was the only legitimate path to security, even though childbirth killed women at rates we can barely comprehend today. Even though a husband had legal rights to beat a wife as long as the stick was no thicker than his thumb. Even though divorce was essentially impossible, and annulment required papal intervention. You hear one of the village women mutter a blessing as the bride passes, and it's not about happiness or love, it's about survival. May your womb be fruitful, and your childbed safe. That's the prayer. That's what matters. The garlic the bride carries protects her value as a reproductive vessel, as a manager of household resources, as a link in the chain of inheritance and property transfer. Do you remember the negotiations you overheard earlier? One detail keeps echoing in your mind. The groom's family insisted on a clause about returning the dowry if the bride failed to produce children within 3 years. Failed marriages could be dissolved if they remained unconsummated or childless, and the financial implications were devastating. The bride's father aged visibly while agreeing to that term. If his daughter's marriage fails, his other daughters become harder to marry off. The entire family's reputation hinges on her ability to conceive, deliver, and raise healthy children in a household that doesn't yet accept her. The economic pressure creates spiritual vulnerability. If you believe demons target human weakness, then a bride carrying the weight of 2 families' financial futures becomes an obvious target. The garlic isn't superstition, it's practical protection for someone whose entire existence has been commodified, whose body is discussed in terms of property value, whose success or failure will ripple through social networks and economic systems. The smell of garlic becomes the smell of defense against collapse, against ruin, against the invisible forces that exploit moments of transition and vulnerability. The procession reaches the manor house, and you see the feast tables already laid out in the great hall, trestle boards covered with cloth, wooden trenchers waiting for food, cups for ale and wine. The celebration will last hours, possibly into tomorrow, but underneath the music and eating and drinking, everyone understands what this day really represents. Not romance, not passion, but survival, strategy, and the cold arithmetic of medieval life where love was a luxury few could afford and protection, even protection purchased with pungent herbs, was essential. You step into the manor hall behind the wedding party, and the air shifts. Everyone feels it. That peculiar tension that settles over thresholds and doorways. The bride hesitates for just a heartbeat before crossing into the space where the feast will happen, and her hesitation isn't about cold feet or second thoughts. She's afraid of what might be waiting on the other side of that threshold. Medieval people believed doorways were dangerous, liminal spaces where the barrier between worlds grew thin, where demons and malicious spirits congregated like beggars waiting for alms. And a wedding threshold? That was the most dangerous doorway of all. You need to understand how real these spirits were to medieval minds. Not metaphorical, not symbolic, but as tangible as the wooden beams overhead or the rushes scattered across the floor. Every village had stories about weddings ruined by supernatural interference. The bride who suddenly went mad during the ceremony, speaking in voices not her own. The groom who dropped dead at the altar, his face twisted in agony, with no wound and no poison found. The couple who seemed fine through the feast but whose marriage bed burst into flames that night. Flames that consumed only the mattress and left the wooden frame untouched. These weren't cautionary tales told to children. They were recent events, documented in church records, whispered about in markets, used as evidence that evil forces took particular interest in matrimony. The theology behind this belief was surprisingly sophisticated. Marriage represented the creation of new family lines, new alliances, new sources of human souls that would eventually populate either heaven or hell. Demons had a vested interest in corrupting marriages at their inception. A cursed union could produce generations of damaged souls, spreading misery and sin like ripples across a pond. The wedding day, specifically the moment of transition when the bride moved from her father's protection to her husband's authority, created a gap in spiritual defences. She belonged fully to neither household. She existed in between, unanchored, vulnerable. Church officials documented cases of demonic interference with the same bureaucratic thoroughness they applied to property disputes. A 1342 ecclesiastical court record from Norwich describes a wedding where the bride began screaming during the vows that she could see a great black dog with eyes of fire near the altar, though no one else saw anything. The ceremony was halted. 3 priests performed an exorcism. The wedding resumed 2 weeks later with additional protections, not just garlic, but blessed salt scattered across every threshold, holy water sprinkled on the bridal gown, and a relic of St. Margaret placed under the marriage bed. The marriage proceeded normally after that, producing 4 children, all of whom survived to adulthood. Proof, in medieval eyes, that the demonic threat had been real and the protections effective. You watch the bride finally cross the threshold, stepping carefully over a line of garlic cloves someone placed there earlier. Her mother-in-law-to-be stands just inside, holding more garlic, and she reaches out to press a clove into the bride's free hand, the hand that isn't already clutching her bridal bundle. This gesture is protection, but it's also claiming. The older woman is asserting authority, demonstrating that in this household she knows the proper rituals, she commands the defences, and the new bride will learn to defer to her knowledge. Historians still argue whether belief in wedding demons was universal across medieval society or concentrated in rural, less educated populations, but evidence suggests even nobility took these threats seriously. When Edward II's daughter married in 1325, the royal household accounts list expenses for herbs of protection and payments to a village cunning woman who specialised in warding ceremonies. If kings worried about demons at their daughters' weddings, everyone else certainly did too. The specific demons feared at weddings had names and characteristics. There was Asmodeus, the demon of lust who twisted marital intimacy into violence and perversion. There were the unnamed spirits of jealousy who infected brides with paranoia and grooms with rage. There were entities that specialized in barrenness, who sealed wombs closed or caused miscarriages, destroying the primary purpose of medieval marriage. And then there were the formless malevolent forces, not demons with specific identities, but general evil that congregated wherever humans experienced joy, specifically to spoil it, to curdle happiness into suffering because that's what evil did. You notice the wedding guests arranging themselves carefully in the hall, and nobody sits directly in the path between the entrance and the hearth fire. That's a spirit road, a pathway that supernatural entities use to travel through buildings, and sitting in it invites possession or illness. The bride and groom are positioned with their backs to the fire, the warmth a purifying force that protects their vulnerable backs from approach. Every detail of the room arrangement reflects defensive thinking. The placement of religious icons in corners, the iron nails driven into certain beams, the specific herbs hung from rafters. This feast hall is a fortress, and garlic is just one weapon in an arsenal of protections. The priest begins a blessing over the assembled guests, and you notice his Latin includes phrases not from the official liturgy, older words, possibly pre-Christian, that invoke protection from named threats. The Church officially discouraged mixing Christian ritual with pagan practices, but parish priests were pragmatic. They knew their congregations believed in demons at weddings, and if adding a few extra protective blessings kept people faithful and attending Mass, the theological compromise was worth it. A serving girl brings bread and salt to the bride, the first food she'll taste in her new household, and even this simple act carries defensive purpose. Bread represents Christ's body, a Christian protection, while salt has been used to ward off evil since before Rome existed. The bride takes a small bite, chews carefully, swallows. She's still holding garlic in one hand. She hasn't set it down since leaving her father's house. She won't set it down until after the bedding ceremony tonight, and even then she'll keep it within reach. You wonder what it feels like to live with this level of supernatural fear, to believe that invisible entities are literally waiting for you to make a mistake, to drop your guard, to forget your garlic. Modern people sometimes dismiss medieval superstition as ignorance, but these beliefs served psychological functions. In a world where random catastrophe struck constantly, plagues without warning, famines without explanation, sudden deaths with no apparent cause, attributing disaster to demons at least provided an illusion of control. If you knew what threatened you, you could defend against it. The garlic wasn't ignorance, it was hope. It was agency in a world that offered precious little of either. The bride sits at the high table now, her garlic placed carefully beside her trencher, and you see her glancing toward the shadows in the corner of the hall, watching for movement that shouldn't be there, listening for voices that don't match the mouths speaking. She's terrified, and her terror is completely rational given what she believes. Tonight she'll consummate her marriage in a room where demons might be watching, waiting, hoping to corrupt the act or curse any potential conception. The garlic is her only shield besides prayer, and prayer alone has failed before. Everyone knows stories where prayer wasn't enough. So she holds the garlic, breathes its sharp scent, and tries to believe it will be sufficient to keep the evil away from her vulnerable, transitioning, economically valuable, spiritually endangered self. You need to understand that garlic's reputation as a demon repellent didn't begin in medieval Europe. It stretches back thousands of years, crossing cultures that never contacted each other, appearing in traditions so ancient that nobody remembers who first discovered its protective properties. You're standing now in a different time, a different place. Ancient Egypt, roughly 2600 BCE, watching workers construct the pyramids under the merciless sun. They receive daily rations of garlic, onions, and radishes. And while modern historians emphasize the nutritional benefits, garlic prevented scurvy and boosted immune systems for men doing brutal physical labor, the workers themselves believed something more. They believed garlic protected their spirits while their bodies were weakened by exhaustion, that it kept malevolent forces from exploiting their vulnerability. Egyptian medical papyri, some dating to 1550 BCE, prescribed garlic for everything from infections to heart problems. But the language used reveals something beyond medical treatment. The Ebers Papyrus describes garlic as a substance that drives away the demons of illness and purifies the blood against invisible enemies. The Egyptians didn't distinguish clearly between physical disease and spiritual attack. Illness was often understood as demonic possession or curse, and garlic treated both the symptom and the supernatural cause simultaneously. Tomb paintings show garlic bulbs placed alongside deceased pharaohs, protection for the journey through the underworld where demons waited to devour souls that passed without proper defences. You shift forward in time, landing in ancient Greece around 400 BCE. Hippocrates, the father of Western medicine, prescribes garlic for respiratory problems and digestive complaints, but Olympic athletes consume it for a different reason. They believe it increases courage and diminishes fear by driving away the spirits of cowardice that wait at competition sites, hoping to infect competitors with weakness. Greek soldiers head into battle eat raw garlic cloves, and yes, the sulfur compounds probably did provide some health benefits, but the soldiers themselves believe they're armoring their souls, making themselves spiritually indigestible to the fear demons that haunt battlefields and feed on terror. Roman legionaries carried garlic on every campaign, so much so that garlic cultivation spread across Europe following Roman conquest. The plant literally marched with the armies. A Roman military manual from the 1st century CE recommends garlic for strength of body and protection of spirit, and archaeological digs at Roman military camps across Britain and Germany reveal garlic storage pits built near barracks. Pliny the Elder, writing his Natural History around 77 CE, catalogues dozens of uses for garlic, including warding off serpents and scorpions and protecting against sorceries and evil spirits. He notes that garlic hung over doorways prevents witches from entering, a practice that would continue in Europe for the next 1500 years. Historians still argue whether ancient peoples genuinely believed in garlic's supernatural properties, or whether the medicinal benefits were so obvious that spiritual explanations developed as folk rationalization. But the textual evidence suggests real conviction. A Greek charm from the 3rd century BCE, preserved on a papyrus fragment, instructs, "Take garlic and place it beneath your pillow to prevent night demons from stealing your breath while you sleep." This isn't metaphor, it's instruction manual, written with the assumption that night demons are real entities with real physical habits that garlic genuinely disrupts. The mechanism by which garlic supposedly worked varied by culture, but certain themes appeared universally. The smell was consistently identified as the active ingredient. Demons found the odour repulsive, physically painful, or disorienting. Some traditions held that demons breathed differently than humans, that garlic's sulphur compounds interfered with their respiration. Others believed demons navigated by scent, tracking human souls by their spiritual odour, and garlic masked that scent, making humans invisible to supernatural predators. Still others thought garlic's pungency was simply so overwhelming, so aggressively alive that it repelled entities associated with death and decay. You watch a Jewish family in 1st century Judea preparing for Passover, and garlic appears prominently in the ritual foods, not just for flavour but for protection during a night when the angel of death passes through Egypt in the retelling of the Exodus story. Even though they're commemorating ancient events, the protective symbolism remains active. The garlic on the table isn't just remembering ancient protection, it's providing present protection against forces that still threaten. The Talmud, compiled over the following centuries, contains extensive discussion of garlic's properties, including its ability to drive away demons from the household, and its appropriateness for consumption on the Sabbath specifically, because it strengthens the body's spiritual defences when work and ordinary protective activities are forbidden. In China, roughly the same era, garlic appears in Taoist alchemical texts as an ingredient in longevity elixirs and protective talismans. The logic differs from Western traditions. Chinese medicine understood garlic as a yang food, associated with heat, light, and aggressive energy that repelled yin entities like ghosts and demons that thrived in cold, damp, dark spaces. But the practical application was identical. Hang garlic near doorways, consume it before risky spiritual activities, wear it when travelling through areas known for supernatural dangers. By the time medieval Europe inherited these traditions, garlic had accumulated 4,000 years of reputation as demon repellent, passed down through Egyptian, Greek, Roman, Jewish, and various tribal European cultures. The medieval bride clutching garlic in that chapel wasn't following a new superstition. She was the latest practitioner of one of humanity's oldest protective rituals, performing an act that her ancestors 40 centuries earlier would have immediately recognized and understood. The continuity is remarkable. A protective practice that originated in ancient Egypt, that appears in classical Greece and Rome, that persists through the collapse of the Western Roman Empire and the chaos of the early medieval period, that gets incorporated into Christian ceremony despite the Church's suspicion of pagan practices. This kind of cultural endurance suggests the belief met deep psychological needs. Whether or not garlic actually repels supernatural entities, humans across vast spans of time and geography believed it did, and that belief shaped behaviour, ritual, and wedding ceremonies for millennia. You return to the medieval feast and you see the bride's garlic bundle with fresh eyes now. It's not just a quirky medieval custom, but the continuation of ancient wisdom, proven through generations, blessed by time and tradition. When she clutches those cloves, she's holding the same protection Egyptian pyramid workers held, that Greek athletes carried, that Roman legionaries trusted, that Jewish families blessed. The garlic connects her to an unbroken chain of human fear and human defense, stretching back before written history, back to the moment when someone first discovered that this pungent bulb, this aggressive-smelling plant, somehow made the darkness feel less threatening and the invisible dangers less immediate. And if 4,000 years of human experience says garlic protects against demons, who is she to doubt it? Who are we? You follow the bride and groom as the feast winds down and the moment everyone has been anticipating and dreading approaches, the bedding ceremony. In modern imagination, the wedding night might seem romantic, private, intimate, but in medieval reality it was a public spectacle, a witnessed event, and potentially the most supernaturally dangerous moment in the entire marriage process. You watch as the older women begin to gather around the bride, separating her from the remaining guests, and the men do the same with the groom. There's bawdy laughter, crude jokes shouted across the hall, but underneath the ribald humour you detect genuine anxiety. What's about to happen isn't just sex, it's a spiritual gauntlet that could determine the success or failure of the entire marriage. The bride is led upstairs to the chamber that's been prepared, and you notice she's still carrying her garlic, now slightly wilted from hours of clutching but still potent. The room has been meticulously prepared, the bed positioned away from the door, the single window shuttered and sealed, religious icons positioned at all four corners. Fresh garlic has been braided into ropes and hung from the bedposts. More cloves are scattered under the mattress. The sheets themselves have been washed in water infused with garlic and blessed herbs. This bedroom is a fortress, because what's about to happen here represents the moment of ultimate vulnerability. Medieval theology taught that sexual intercourse, even within marriage, opened spiritual doorways. The act of physical union created a temporary weakness in the soul's defences, a moment when demonic entities could slip inside human consciousness, when curses could take hold, when evil could plant itself in the very moment new life might be conceived. Church teaching was contradictory on this point. Sex within marriage was blessed and necessary for procreation, the primary purpose of matrimony, yet it also carried inherent spiritual danger. Augustine and other early church fathers wrote extensively about how even marital sex retained a taint of original sin, how lust could never be fully purified even in the marriage bed, and how demons specifically targeted moments of sexual union. The women help the bride undress, and as each layer of clothing comes off, they replace it with protective measures. A small sachet of garlic is tied around her neck with red thread. Red because it's the colour of Christ's blood, a Christian protection layered over pagan practice. More garlic cloves are tucked into her hair, which has been unbraided so demons can't hide in the plaits. Her shift, the final layer she'll wear to bed, has been embroidered at the hem with symbols that predate Christianity, spirals and knots that trap evil spirits, geometric patterns that confuse demonic navigation. The garlic smell in this room is overwhelming now, sharp enough to make your eyes water, and that's exactly the point. The groom is being prepared in a similar fashion down the hall. The men are joking more openly, louder, but they're also tying garlic around his waist, crushing cloves and rubbing the juice on his chest and back, making sure he's protected because male vulnerability was also real. Demons could curse a man with impotence, preventing consummation and therefore invalidating the marriage. They could drain his life force during the sexual act, leaving him weakened or dead. Stories circulated about grooms who entered the marriage chamber healthy and emerged at dawn aged decades, all vitality stolen by succubi who'd infiltrated the wedding night. Historians still argue whether these bedding rituals were performed seriously or had become semi-comic traditions by the late medieval period, but the evidence suggests genuine belief persisted. A 1389 church investigation in Yorkshire examined a case where a marriage was annulled because the groom claimed demonic interference on the wedding night. He testified that he felt a great coldness enter the chamber and afterward found himself unable to perform his marital duty. The church took this seriously enough to conduct interviews, examine witnesses, and ultimately grant the annulment based on supernatural grounds. The moment arrives. The bride is placed in the bed, propped up on pillows, the sheets drawn to her waist. The groom is led in, and now both families crowd into the chamber. Parents, siblings, aunts, uncles, even some honoured guests. A priest enters last, carrying a censer of smoking incense mixed with, you smell it, more garlic. He walks round the bed 3 times, chanting prayers in Latin, blessing the union, asking God's protection against all enemies visible and invisible, a phrase that specifically acknowledged demonic threats. He sprinkles holy water on the couple, on the bed, on the floor around the bed in a complete circle. Salt is scattered at the threshold to prevent anything from crossing after the room is sealed. Then everyone leaves. The door closes. The couple is alone, surrounded by garlic, enclosed in blessed circles, armed with prayers and protections, but still fundamentally vulnerable because what they're about to do is inherently dangerous according to every authority they trust. The bride's hands shake as she reaches for the garlic bundle placed on the table beside the bed. The groom sits on the edge of the mattress, not touching her yet, both of them listening to the darkness, wondering if something is listening back. You need to understand the genuine terror involved. These aren't modern people who can laugh off superstition. They've grown up hearing detailed accounts of wedding nights that went catastrophically wrong. The bride knows about the woman 3 villages over whose first child was born twisted and deformed, blamed on demonic interference during conception. The groom remembers the story about his uncle's friend who died in his marriage bed, found at dawn with his face frozen in an expression of horror, no wounds, no explanation except supernatural attack. These aren't distant legends. They're recent events, personal connections, evidence that the danger is real. The consummation itself becomes a ritual act, performed according to specific guidelines designed to minimize spiritual vulnerability. Certain prayers should be said first. The act itself should be conducted with gravity, not excessive passion, because too much lust opened wider doorways for demons. Afterward, more prayers. The garlic stays within reach throughout. Neither partner should fall asleep immediately. Sleep after sex was particularly dangerous, the soul especially susceptible to invasion, while consciousness drifted. They should stay awake, stay alert, watch the shadows, keep the garlic close. Modern sensibilities find this bizarre, even tragic. a wedding night dominated by fear rather than joy. But you're watching people who genuinely believe invisible entities want to destroy them specifically in this moment, and they're doing everything their culture has taught them to prevent that destruction. The garlic isn't ruining the romance, it's making the moment survivable. It's the difference between blind terror and defended fear. They're still afraid, but they're not helpless. And in a world where helplessness was the default condition, that distinction mattered enormously. The night deepens. Somewhere in the manor, people are still celebrating. But in this chamber, two frightened young people huddle together surrounded by the overwhelming smell of garlic, performing the biological act that will hopefully produce children and fulfill the economic purpose of their union, while simultaneously trying to protect their souls from forces they cannot see but absolutely believe are watching, waiting, hoping for an opportunity to strike. The garlic is their shield, their weapon, their only tangible defense against intangible threats, and they cling to it with the same desperation they cling to each other, hoping that tomorrow they'll wake up alive, sane and uncursed. The wedding night survived, the marriage successfully begun. You follow the bride and groom as the feast winds down and the moment everyone has been anticipating and dreading approaches: the bedding ceremony. In modern imagination, the wedding night might seem romantic, private, intimate, but in medieval reality it was a public spectacle, a witnessed event, and potentially the most supernaturally dangerous moment in the entire marriage process. You watch as the older women begin to gather around the bride, separating her from the remaining guests, and the men do the same with the groom. There's bawdy laughter, crude jokes shouted across the hall, but underneath the ribald humour you detect genuine anxiety. What's about to happen isn't just sex, it's a spiritual gauntlet that could determine the success or failure of the entire marriage. The bride is led upstairs to the chamber that's been prepared, and you notice she's still carrying her garlic, now slightly wilted from hours of clutching but still potent. The room has been meticulously prepared, the bed positioned away from the door, the single window shuttered and sealed, religious icons positioned at all four corners. Fresh garlic has been braided into ropes and hung from the bedposts. More cloves are scattered under the mattress. The sheets themselves have been washed in water infused with garlic and blessed herbs. This bedroom is a fortress, because what's about to happen here represents the moment of ultimate vulnerability. Medieval theology taught that sexual intercourse, even within marriage, opened spiritual doorways. The act of physical union created a temporary weakness in the soul's defences, a moment when demonic entities could slip inside human consciousness, when curses could take hold, when evil could plant itself in the very moment new life might be conceived. Church teaching was contradictory on this point. Sex within marriage was blessed and necessary for procreation, the primary purpose of matrimony, yet it also carried inherent spiritual danger. Augustine and other early church fathers wrote extensively about how even marital sex retained a taint of original sin, how lust could never be fully purified even in the marriage bed, and how demons specifically targeted moments of sexual union. The women help the bride undress, and as each layer of clothing comes off, they replace it with protective measures. A small sachet of garlic is tied around her neck with red thread. Red because it's the colour of Christ's blood, a Christian protection layered over pagan practice. More garlic cloves are tucked into her hair, which has been unbraided so demons can't hide in the plaits. Her shift, the final layer she'll wear to bed, has been embroidered at the hem with symbols that predate Christianity. Spirals and knots that trap evil spirits, geometric patterns that confuse demonic navigation. The garlic smell in this room is overwhelming now, sharp enough to make your eyes water, and that's exactly the point. The groom is being prepared in a similar fashion down the hall. The men are joking more openly, louder, but they're also tying garlic around his waist, crushing cloves and rubbing the juice on his chest and back, making sure he's protected because male vulnerability was also real. Demons could curse a man with impotence, preventing consummation and therefore invalidating the marriage. They could drain his life force during the sexual act, leaving him weakened or dead. Stories circulated about grooms who entered the marriage chamber healthy and emerged at dawn aged decades, all vitality stolen by succubi who'd infiltrated the wedding night. Historians still argue whether these bedding rituals were performed seriously or had become semi-comic traditions by the late medieval period, but the evidence suggests genuine belief persisted. A 1389 church investigation in Yorkshire examined a case where a marriage was annulled because the groom claimed demonic interference on the wedding night. He testified that he felt a great coldness enter the chamber and afterward found himself unable to perform his marital duty. The church took this seriously enough to conduct interviews, examine witnesses, and ultimately grant the annulment based on supernatural grounds. The moment arrives. The bride is placed in the bed, propped up on pillows, the sheets drawn to her waist. The groom is led in, and now both families crowd into the chamber. Parents, siblings, aunts, uncles, even some honoured guests. A priest enters last, carrying a censer of smoking incense mixed with, you smell it, more garlic. He walks around the bed 3 times, chanting prayers in Latin, blessing the union, asking God's protection against all enemies visible and invisible, a phrase that specifically acknowledged demonic threats. He sprinkles holy water on the couple, on the bed, on the floor around the bed in a complete circle. Salt is scattered at the threshold to prevent anything from crossing after the room is sealed. Then everyone leaves. The door closes. The couple is alone, surrounded by garlic, enclosed in blessed circles, armed with prayers and protections, but still fundamentally vulnerable because what they're about to do is inherently dangerous according to every authority they trust. The bride's hands shake as she reaches for the garlic bundle placed on the table beside the bed. The groom sits on the edge of the mattress, not touching her yet, both of them listening to the darkness, wondering if something is listening back. You need to understand the genuine terror involved. These aren't modern people who can laugh off superstition. They've grown up hearing detailed accounts of wedding nights that went catastrophically wrong. The bride knows about the woman 3 villages over whose first child was born twisted and deformed, blamed on demonic interference during conception. The groom remembers the story about his uncle's friend who died in his marriage bed, found at dawn with his face frozen in an expression of horror, no wounds, no explanation except supernatural attack. These aren't distant legends, they're recent events, personal connections, evidence that the danger is real. The consummation itself becomes a ritual act, performed according to specific guidelines designed to minimize spiritual vulnerability. Certain prayers should be said first. The act itself should be conducted with gravity, not excessive passion, because too much lust opened wider doorways for demons. Afterward, more prayers. The garlic stays within reach throughout. Neither partner should fall asleep immediately. Sleep after sex was particularly dangerous. The soul especially susceptible to invasion while consciousness drifted. They should stay awake, stay alert, watch the shadows, keep the garlic close. Modern sensibilities find this bizarre, even tragic, a wedding night dominated by fear rather than joy. but you're watching people who genuinely believe invisible entities want to destroy them specifically in this moment, and they're doing everything their culture has taught them to prevent that destruction. The garlic isn't ruining the romance, it's making the moment survivable. It's the difference between blind terror and defended fear. They're still afraid, but they're not helpless. And in a world where helplessness was the default condition, that distinction mattered enormously. The night deepens. Somewhere in the manor, people are still celebrating. But in this chamber, two frightened young people huddle together, surrounded by the overwhelming smell of garlic, performing the biological act that will hopefully produce children and fulfill the economic purpose of their union, while simultaneously trying to protect their souls from forces they cannot see, but absolutely believe are watching, waiting, hoping for an opportunity to strike. The garlic is their shield, their weapon, their only tangible defense against intangible threats, and they cling to it with the same desperation they cling to each other, hoping that tomorrow they'll wake up alive, sane and uncursed. The wedding night survived, the marriage successfully begun. You step back from that tension-filled chamber and drift through medieval streets, following your nose because the medieval world was fundamentally a place of smells, overwhelming, inescapable, constant odours that modern sanitized life has erased from experience. And those smells weren't just sensory background noise, they were diagnostic tools, spiritual indicators, survival information encoded in scent. Medieval people understood their world partly through their noses, and what might seem like bizarre superstition to us, that garlic's stench protected while perfume's sweetness invited danger, made perfect sense within their olfactory logic. You're walking through a medieval town on a summer morning, and the smell hits you first. Human waste in the gutters, animal dung from horses and oxen, rotting vegetable matter, the metallic tang of blood from the butcher's stall, wood smoke, unwashed bodies, fermented ale, tanning leather with its nauseating chemical reek. This is normal. This is every day. Medieval noses were calibrated to this baseline of intense odour, and against that background they made crucial distinctions. The smell of sickness was recognisable and feared. The sweet, rotten odour that accompanied plague or gangrene meant death was near. The smell of fire could signal disaster or just bread baking depending on context, and the smell of garlic, that meant protection, purification, aggressive defence against corruption. Medieval medical theory, inherited from ancient Greek physicians, taught that disease spread through miasma, corrupted air carrying illness from place to place. You couldn't see miasma, but you could smell it. Foul odours literally carried sickness, which meant pleasant, sweet odours seemed like obvious antidotes. Except medieval experience contradicted this intuition. The Black Death struck hardest in 1348 and 1349, and people noticed that perfumed nobles died at similar rates to unwashed peasants, sometimes higher rates, because wealth concentrated in cities where plague spread fastest. Meanwhile, households that used garlic extensively, not for pleasure but for food preservation and medicinal purposes, seemed to fare slightly better. Was this real correlation or confirmation bias? Medical historians debate this, but medieval people believed they'd identified a pattern. Harsh smells protected, sweet smells failed. The logic developed from there. If sweet perfume didn't protect against plague, the most obvious form of demonic attack, since medieval theology taught that disease was divine punishment or demonic assault, then perhaps perfume actually attracted evil. Perhaps demons were drawn to sweetness the way flies were drawn to honey. Perhaps masking natural human odour with pleasant fragrances was spiritually dangerous, hiding the authentic smell of a human soul under false pretences, creating the olfactory equivalent of a disguise that confused protective angels while giving demons easier access. Garlic, by contrast, was aggressively honest. Its smell announced itself. Overwhelmed, subtler odours couldn't be mistaken for anything else. If you encountered someone reeking of garlic, you knew immediately. There was no deception, no mask. Medieval spiritual thinking valued this kind of transparency. Demons were deceivers, manipulators, beings who specialized in appearing as something they weren't. Garlic's unsubtle, unmistakable stench was the opposite of demonic deception. It was forthright, honest, impossible to misinterpret. A bride wearing garlic was declaring her humanity openly, making herself spiritually legible, preventing demonic impersonation. You watch a perfume merchant in the town marketplace, and his business tells you something important about medieval social hierarchies. Perfume was expensive, made from imported spices, flower essences, and animal musks that travelled thousands of miles along trade routes. Only wealthy people could afford it, and they used it liberally, partly for status display, but also because they genuinely believed pleasant smells indicated spiritual purity. The nobility perfumed their bodies, their clothes, their living spaces, creating bubbles of artificial sweetness that separated them from common odours. But this very luxury marked them as targets for demonic attention, or so the common wisdom held among peasants who couldn't afford perfume anyway. Historians still argue whether anti-perfume attitudes were genuine spiritual conviction or class resentment disguised as theology, poor people finding reasons why their poverty was actually spiritual superiority, but the evidence suggests both operated simultaneously. Church writings from the period warn against excessive perfume use as vanity, as attempting to improve on God's creation, as prideful beautification that invited demonic temptation. A 13th century sermon warns, "The woman who perfumes herself to please men attracts not only human lust but demonic attention, for demons are drawn to deception and artifice as moths to flame." Wedding traditions reflected this suspicion. A bride who wore perfume instead of garlic was making a statement about her priorities. She valued seduction over protection, appearance over safety, worldly pleasure over spiritual defense. Some noble weddings did feature perfumed brides, particularly in Italian and French courts where luxury was expected, but even there, garlic was incorporated somewhere, hidden in sachets, mixed into the wedding feast, placed under the marriage bed. The perfume was for show, for guests, for maintaining social status. The garlic was for survival. You return to that English bride in her saffron dress, and you understand now why she carries garlic so openly, why she doesn't attempt to mask its smell with sweeter herbs or flower waters. The pungent odour is the point. It broadcasts her protection, announces her defended status to both human witnesses and supernatural observers. When she walks through crowds and people catch the sharp scent, they know she's taking her spiritual safety seriously. When she enters the marriage chamber reeking of garlic, she's creating an olfactory barrier that demons supposedly cannot cross. The sensory experience of medieval weddings was completely different from modern ceremonies because smell played such a central role. Modern weddings feature flowers chosen partly for fragrance, roses, lilies, lavender, creating pleasant, romantic atmospheres. Medieval weddings assaulted the nose with garlic, with incense heavy on frankincense and myrrh, both traditionally protective, with the smell of unwashed bodies in crowded halls, with food heavily spiced not just for flavour, but for preservation and protection. The sensory memory of a medieval wedding was dominated by harsh, aggressive odours that modern people would find unpleasant, but those odours communicated safety, proper ritual observance, and spiritual preparedness. There's something almost touching about this once you understand it. Medieval people trying to protect their most vulnerable moments with the tools available to them. And one of their most reliable tools was smell. They couldn't control invisible demons, couldn't see spiritual threats, couldn't predict when supernatural attack might strike, but they could control odour. They could surround themselves with the stench so powerful it became armour, so unmistakable it became a beacon saying, "This person is defended, this space is protected, evil is not welcome here." The garlic smell that modern people would find repulsive at a wedding was, to medieval noses, the smell of love defended, of joy protected, of celebration armoured against the darkness that constantly threatened to overwhelm everything beautiful and good. It was, in its own pungent way, the smell of hope. You leave that English chapel and begin travelling now, drifting across medieval Europe like smoke, because the garlic wedding tradition wasn't uniform. It twisted and adapted to regional customs, local beliefs, village-specific rituals that transformed the basic protective principle into dozens of variations. You land first in a small Polish village in the year 1380, and here you discover that brides don't just carry garlic, they wear it elaborately, woven into crowns that sit on their heads like pungent tiaras. The Polish garlic crown is constructed days before the wedding by the bride's female relatives, who gather in her family's cottage with baskets of fresh bulbs and strips of red cloth. You watch them work. They select the finest garlic heads, ones with smooth skins and full cloves, and they braid them together using a technique passed down through generations. The braiding itself is ritualistic, accompanied by songs in Polish that predate Christian influence, songs about protecting daughters from the night spirits and the hungry shadows. The completed crown is thick, heavy, circular, impressive, sometimes containing 30 or 40 garlic bulbs woven together with wheat stalks for fertility and red thread for Christ's blood. When placed on the bride's head, it's so substantial it requires pinning to stay secure. The symbolism multiplies here. The crown shape invokes royalty. The bride is queen for a day, but also queen of her own defence, crowned with protection rather than jewels. The circular form has no beginning or end, creating an unbroken barrier that demons cannot penetrate. Each garlic bulb radiates protective power outward, creating overlapping shields that reinforce each other, and the sheer weight of it, sometimes 2 or 3 pounds, serves as constant physical reminder. The bride cannot forget her protection because it literally presses down on her head with every step, every turn, every movement throughout the ceremony and feast. You drift southwest to Bavaria, where the tradition takes a different form entirely. Here, garlic isn't just worn or carried, it's used to literally mark boundaries. You watch a Bavarian wedding preparation where the groom's family arrives at the bride's family home the night before the ceremony, and together they create a garlic perimeter. Fresh cloves are crushed and mixed with salt and olive oil, creating a pungent paste, and this mixture is rubbed onto every doorframe, every window ledge, every threshold the bride will cross during her transition from maiden to wife. The smell is extraordinary, overwhelming, but it creates what they call a demon wall, an invisible barrier that supposedly prevents evil from following the bride as she moves between households. The Bavarian bride also wears garlic, but in pouches sewn into the lining of her dress. hidden protection that works invisibly like armor worn beneath clothing. Sometimes these pouches number 12, representing the apostles, with each pouch blessed by the priest and positioned at strategic points on her body, over her heart, at her wrists, behind her knees where blood vessels run close to the surface. The logic held that demons entered the body through pulse points, places where life force was most accessible, and garlic at these locations created defensive barriers at the most vulnerable entry points. You move north to Scandinavia, where the tradition intersects with older Norse customs and the garlic gets mixed with other protective elements. A Norwegian bride in 1365 carries not just garlic, but a bundle that includes garlic, iron nails, and a small piece of silver, 3 protections from 3 different spiritual traditions. The garlic defends against demons, the iron protects against fairies and nature spirits. Iron was believed poisonous to the fair folk, and the silver guards against witchcraft and curses. The bundle is wrapped in white wool and tied with braided horsehair, creating a complex protective talisman that addresses threats from multiple supernatural sources simultaneously. In some Swedish villages, the garlic tradition extends beyond the bride to create protective corridors. The path from the church to the feast location is lined with crushed garlic mixed into the dirt, creating a scented pathway that demons supposedly cannot cross. Wedding guests walk this garlic road, and the smell rising from disturbed earth announces the procession before anyone becomes visible. Children of the village are hired to refresh the garlic line throughout the day, ensuring the protection doesn't fade before the bride completes her journey. Historians still argue whether these regional variations developed independently or spread through trade routes and cultural exchange, but genetic analysis of garlic varieties suggests both processes operated simultaneously. Each region adapted the basic protective principle to local growing conditions. Polish garlic was often the hardneck variety with large, easy-to-braid bulbs, while Mediterranean regions used softneck varieties that stored longer and could be dried into decorative braids that hung in homes year-round. You drift south to Italy, where garlic wedding traditions took on particularly elaborate forms in rural villages. A Tuscan bride might wear a garlic necklace so long it reached her waist, each bulb hand-selected for a size and blessed individually by the village priest. During the ceremony, specific bulbs would be removed at ritual moments, one when she entered the church, one when vows were exchanged, one when she left the church, and these removed bulbs would be buried in specific locations as permanent protective wards. The bulb from entering the church went under the threshold of her new home. The vow bulb was buried where the couple would eventually be buried, protecting their graves. The departure bulb was planted in the garden where it would grow, creating living protection that regenerated annually. In Sicily, garlic appeared in the wedding feast in mandatory dishes that every guest had to consume. You sit at a Sicilian wedding table, where course after course contains garlic, pasta with aglio e olio, roasted lamb rubbed with garlic and rosemary, bread spread with garlic butter, vegetables sautéed in garlic-infused oil. The feast became a communal protection ritual, where every participant consumed garlic, making the entire wedding party collectively defended. If demons attacked, they'd have to overcome not just the bride's protection, but the cumulative defensive power of 50 or 100 guests all reeking of garlic, all carrying its protective properties in their blood and breath. Eastern European Jewish communities integrated garlic into wedding ceremonies in ways that blended with kosher dietary laws and rabbinic teaching. A Jewish bride in 15th century Prague might wear a small garlic clove sewn into the hem of her dress with blue thread. blue being particularly protective in Jewish tradition, representing divine presence. The wedding contract, the ketubah, might be signed with ink that included garlic essence, literally writing protection into the legal document that established the marriage. And the wedding meal always featured garlic in the challah bread, baked directly into the ceremonial food, making blessing and protection inseparable. Do you remember the English bride from earlier? Her single bundle of garlic seems almost modest now compared to these elaborate regional traditions. But whether wearing crowns of 40 bulbs or carrying a single clove, the underlying purpose remained constant, creating a barrier between vulnerable humans and supernatural threats. During the dangerous transition of marriage, the variations revealed not disagreement about the threat, but cultural creativity in defense, each region developing its own version of garlic armor, its own ritual language for saying, "Protect this bride, protect this marriage, protect this fragile moment of joy," against everything that wants to destroy it. The garlic smell would linger for days after these weddings, in the church, in the feast halls, on the clothing of everyone who attended. Modern people might find this revolting, but in medieval understanding, that lingering scent meant lingering protection. The garlic continued working long after the ceremony ended, maintaining its defensive barrier as the couple adjusted to married life, as the bride settled into a new household, as the supernatural vulnerability of the transition period slowly faded into the relative safety of established routine. You stand now outside a stone church in rural France, year 1398, and you're about to witness something that reveals just how complicated the relationship between Christianity and garlic wedding customs actually was. The priest, Father Guillaume, a man in his 50s with ink-stained fingers from copying manuscripts, is preparing for a wedding ceremony, and you can see the tension in his face. On the altar, he's arranged the standard religious items: the Bible, communion vessels, holy water, blessed candles. But on a side table, barely visible from the congregation's view, sits a basket of garlic bulbs. He keeps glancing at it, his expression somewhere between resignation and disapproval. The Catholic Church had complicated feelings about garlic weddings. Official doctrine held that Christian sacraments provided complete spiritual protection. Baptism, communion, marriage itself, as a sacrament, created an impenetrable shield of divine grace that made additional protections unnecessary. Theologically, carrying garlic suggested either that God's protection was insufficient, or that demonic powers were equal to divine powers, both of which were heretical positions. Several church councils, including the Fourth Lateran Council in 1215, had issued statements discouraging pagan practices at Christian ceremonies, and garlic fell squarely into that category, given its pre-Christian origins. But here's what you notice. Father Guillaume is going to bless the garlic anyway. He has to. Because if he refuses, the wedding might not happen. The bride's family would find a priest who would accommodate the tradition, or worse, they'd conduct folk ceremonies outside church authority entirely, and the church was more afraid of losing influence than of tolerating a bit of theological impurity. So compromise evolved. Priests blessed the garlic, bringing it officially under Christian authority, transforming a pagan protection into a Christian one through the power of blessing, or at least that's how they justified it. You watch Father Guillaume perform the blessing now before the congregation arrives. He sprinkles holy water on the garlic bulbs while murmuring a Latin prayer that's not in any official liturgy. The prayer asks God to infuse these humble plants with protective grace and to make them weapons against the enemy. The capitalized enemy, that's Satan, demons, the forces of spiritual evil, that Christianity absolutely believed were real and active in the world. By framing garlic as God-empowered rather than inherently magical, the Church could accept the practice while maintaining theological consistency. The garlic didn't work because it was garlic. It worked because God chose to work through garlic, the same way he worked through blessed water and consecrated bread. This compromise was replicated thousands of times across medieval Europe. Parish priests caught between official doctrine and popular demand found ways to Christianize folk practices rather than eliminate them. Some priests developed elaborate blessing rituals for wedding garlic that rivaled the blessings for holy oil or communion wine. Others took a more pragmatic approach. They blessed the garlic quickly, almost embarrassedly, then moved on to properly liturgical elements. A few refused entirely and lost their congregations to more accommodating clergy. Historians still argue whether this represents Christianity absorbing paganism or paganism persisting under Christian veneer, but perhaps that dichotomy is too simple. What you're watching is practical theology, the messy reality of religious life where people's fears and needs shaped doctrine as much as doctrine shaped practice. Medieval Christians genuinely believed in demons. The Bible mentions them constantly. Jesus performed exorcisms. Church teaching confirmed their existence and activity. If demons were real and dangerous, and if empirical evidence suggested garlic helped defend against them, then what kind of priest would deny his flock that protection based on technicalities? Some church officials went further than mere tolerance and actively promoted garlic use within Christian framework. A 14th century French bishop wrote a pastoral letter encouraging brides to carry garlic as Eve might have carried herbs from Eden, recognizing God's provision of natural defenses against evil. He argued that God created garlic specifically for spiritual protection, the way he created other plants for food or medicine, and refusing to use it was actually rejecting divine providence. This theological argument, garlic as God's gift rather than pagan superstition, became increasingly common in late medieval church documents, revealing how official positions evolved to accommodate popular practice. The wedding ceremony begins now, and you see the compromise in action. The bride processes down the aisle carrying garlic openly, but also carrying a small prayer book, Christian and pre-Christian elements together. Father Guillaume conducts the ceremony entirely in Latin, using proper liturgical forms, but at the moment of exchanging vows, he pauses to press a garlic clove into each partner's palm before they join hands. This isn't in the Roman ritual, the official guide for conducting sacraments, but it's become local custom, and he performs it with the same solemnity he brings to properly authorized elements. During his homily, Father Guillaume addresses the garlic directly, something you notice he's prepared carefully. He doesn't mention demons or supernatural threats that would validate pre-Christian cosmology too openly. Instead, he talks about spiritual vigilance, about how married couples must guard against temptation, about how the devil prowls like a roaring lion seeking souls to devour, biblical language that acknowledges demonic threat without explicitly connecting it to the garlic everyone can smell. Then he adds, almost casually, that God provides many tools for spiritual defense, and wise Christians use all of them. The congregation nods. Everyone understands what he's really saying. After the vows, Father Guillaume performs another interesting hybrid ritual. He takes the blessed garlic from the side table and creates a cross shape with 4 bulbs on the altar, positioning the couple's joined hands over this garlic cross while he delivers the final blessing. He's literally combining Christian symbolism with garlic protection in a single gesture, creating a ritual that's simultaneously orthodox and heterodox, Christian and something older. The theological gymnastics required to justify this would be impressive if they weren't so desperate. You notice other clergy in attendance, a visiting monk from a nearby monastery who watches the garlic elements with barely concealed disdain, and the local bishop's representative who takes careful notes. The church hierarchy was always watching, always evaluating, always trying to control popular religious practice, and garlic weddings represented a frontier where that control was contested. Some regions had priests who refused any accommodation and faced empty churches. Others had priests who embraced folk customs so thoroughly that visiting bishops worried about heresy. Most fell somewhere in the middle, like Father Guillaume, trying to serve their congregations while not overtly defying church authority. The medieval church's position on wedding garlic reflects its broader struggle with popular religion. Christianity was officially in charge. Europe was Christendom, unified under papal authority, every person baptized into the faith. But underneath that official structure, older beliefs persisted, adapted, merged with Christian elements in countless local variations. The garlic bride was one visible symbol of this tension, walking down church aisles carrying protection that predated Christianity by millennia, receiving blessings from priests who weren't entirely sure they should be blessing this but did it anyway, because theological purity mattered less than pastoral care. As the ceremony concludes and the couple leaves the church, Father Guillaume returns the unused garlic to its basket. Tomorrow he'll bless garlic for another wedding. Next month, several more. He's performed hundreds of these ceremonies, and the awkward compromise has become routine. He's made his peace with it, the way medieval Christianity made peace with dozens of folk practices it couldn't eliminate, and eventually stopped trying to. The garlic smells just as strong whether blessed or unblessed, and whether God's grace actually flows through these pungent bulbs, or whether they work through some older power, the protection feels real to the people who need it, and in the end, that's what matters to a parish priest serving real people with real fears in a world full of threats both visible and invisible. You're standing in the bride's chamber again, but now you notice something you overlooked before. She's not alone. Surrounding her are 6 other young women, all dressed identically to the bride, all wearing the same saffron yellow wool, all with garlic woven into their hair, all carrying similar bundles of protective herbs. At first glance, you can barely tell which one is actually the bride. This isn't coincidence. This is strategy. These are the bridesmaids, and they're not here just for emotional support or ceremonial decoration. They're decoys, human shields, sacrificial distractions designed to confuse the demonic forces targeting the bride. The logic behind this practice was grimly tactical. Medieval belief held that demons attacking a wedding specifically targeted the bride. She was the valuable prize, the vulnerable soul in transition, the one whose corruption or death would cause maximum damage to the marriage, the families, and the future bloodline. But demons, while powerful, supposedly had limitations. They couldn't be everywhere simultaneously. They could be confused, misdirked, fooled by clever deception. If 7 identically dressed women all reeking of garlic processed together, the demon would have to choose which one to attack, and with only a 1 in 7 chance of selecting the actual bride, the odds shifted in humanity's favour. You watch the bridesmaids prepare, and you realize this role carried genuine risk. If the deception worked, and a demon attacked the wrong woman, that bridesmaid would suffer the curse, or possession, or illness intended for the bride. This wasn't theoretical danger. Village records document bridesmaids who fell mysteriously ill during or after wedding ceremonies, who developed strange afflictions, who died suddenly in the days following weddings. Modern historians attribute these cases to food poisoning, stress-induced illness, or undiagnosed conditions, but medieval communities interpreted them as evidence that the bridesmaid strategy worked. The demon struck the decoy instead of the bride, and while the decoy's fate was tragic, the marriage itself was protected. Families chose bridesmaids carefully. They were usually unmarried women of similar age and social status to the bride. The more similar, the better the deception. Close friends, yes, but also cousins, sisters, neighbours' daughters. Some villages had semi-professional bridesmaids, women who served this role repeatedly because they'd survived previous ceremonies without incident, suggesting either exceptional luck or unusual demonic resistance. These experienced bridesmaids commanded higher fees. Yes, families paid bridesmaids, compensating them for the risk they undertook. The payment might be money, fabric, livestock, or promises of reciprocal service when the bridesmaid eventually married. The garlic each bridesmaid carried was blessed separately. Individualized protection meant to give her some defense even while serving as decoy. Some traditions held that bridesmaids should carry slightly less garlic than the bride, enough to participate in the protective deception, but not so much that they'd be overprotected, and therefore less believable as targets. This created a horrible calculus. How much protection could you give the decoys without making them useless as decoys? Too much protection, and the demon would identify the real bride by process of elimination. Too little, and you were essentially sacrificing young women to supernatural attack. You follow the group as they process toward the church, moving in a tight cluster that makes it difficult to distinguish individuals. They walk in practice formation. The bride is somewhere in the middle, surrounded by her decoys, but even watching carefully you lose track of which one she is. They've rehearsed this. The day before the wedding, they practiced walking together, matching their steps, coordinating their movements so they'd appear as a single unit rather than distinct individuals. The deception had to be convincing not just visually, but energetically, spiritually. They had to project unified identity to fool supernatural observers. Historians still argue whether the bridesmaid tradition originated purely as demonic defense, or whether earlier social functions got reinterpreted through supernatural lens. But written sources from the medieval period explicitly cite protective purposes. A 13th century English text on wedding customs explains that bridesmaids serve to confuse evil spirits and protect the bride through multiplication of targets, as soldiers protect their commander by surrounding him with identically armed men. The military metaphor is telling. This was spiritual warfare, and bridesmaids were infantry. Inside the church, the bridesmaids maintain their formation. They stand together during the ceremony, kneel together, respond to liturgical prompts in unison. The groom, waiting at the altar, has his own complement of identically dressed groomsmen, usually fewer in number because grooms were considered less vulnerable, but still present for similar protective purposes. The wedding party becomes a small army of decoys surrounding the actual couple with human camouflage, creating confusion that supposedly frustrated demonic targeting. At some point during the ceremony, the bride had to be revealed. She couldn't remain hidden forever, and this moment was carefully orchestrated. Usually it happened during the vow exchange, when the bride stepped forward from her group to stand beside the groom. This was the most dangerous instant, the moment when her identity became clear to any watching demonic entities, and the garlic she carried was gripped tighter, the prayers intensified, the protective measures maximized because the deception had ended and direct defense became necessary. But here's a darker element you notice. The bridesmaids didn't disperse immediately after the revelation. They continued to flank the bride throughout the ceremony and into the feast, maintaining proximity, still dressed identically, still carrying garlic. Even after her identity was known, they provided some protective benefit. If a demon attacked, it might still strike a nearby bridesmaid instead of the bride herself, the way arrows meant for a king might hit his bodyguards. The bridesmaids were spiritual bodyguards, and bodyguards sometimes died protecting their charge. You watch one bridesmaid, a girl perhaps 16 with nervous eyes and hands that won't stop trembling, and you wonder what she's thinking. Is she afraid? Resentful of the risk she's been asked to assume? Honoured to serve her friend? Probably all three simultaneously. Medieval sources occasionally preserve bridesmaids' perspectives, usually in saints' lives where a woman served as bridesmaid, survived demonic attack through miraculous intervention, and later entered religious life. These accounts suggest genuine fear combined with religious duty, the belief that protecting a marriage was holy work that justified personal risk. Some families couldn't afford to pay bridesmaids or didn't have enough young women available, and in these cases the bride might process alone or with just one companion, accepting higher supernatural risk because human resources were limited. This created yet another layer of social inequality. Wealthy families could afford more decoys, better protection, higher odds of successful defense against demonic attack. Poor brides were not just economically vulnerable, but spiritually vulnerable too, lacking the human resources to mount effective defense. The bridesmaid tradition persisted long after the specific theological justifications faded. Even as belief in wedding demons declined, bridesmaids remained, their protective function forgotten but their presence maintained. Modern weddings still feature bridesmaids dressed identically to each other, though no longer identically to the bride, and while we explain this as aesthetic coordination or honouring friendships, the structure preserves an ancient defensive formation. The next time you see bridesmaids processing down an aisle in matching dresses, you're watching an echo of medieval spiritual warfare, a fossil of forgotten fear, a tradition that once meant life or death transformed into decoration. Do you remember that trembling bridesmaid? Later that evening, after the feast, she'll return home exhausted, relieved to have survived, her garlic carefully stored for the next wedding where she might be called to serve again. She'll say prayers of gratitude that the demon, if there was a demon, didn't choose her, that she fulfilled her duty without catastrophe, that her friend is safely married and she herself is unharmed. Tomorrow the garlic smell will still cling to her dress, and she'll smile, because that lingering odour means the protection worked. The demon was fooled or deterred or simply didn't come, and everyone survived another wedding, another dangerous transition, another moment when the invisible world pressed close, and human cleverness, human community, and humble garlic somehow prove sufficient to keep the darkness at bay. You drift away from the garlic-carrying bride, and find yourself in a perfumer's workshop in 14th century Venice, where something contradictory is happening. A wealthy merchant's daughter is preparing for her wedding, and unlike the rural brides you've been following, she's commissioning perfume. Expensive, imported, luxurious scent made from attar of roses shipped from Persia, ambergris from distant Wales, musk from Himalayan deer. The perfumer, a man with stained fingers and an encyclopedic knowledge of scent, measures and mixes with practiced precision, creating a fragrance that will cost more than most families earn in a year. And yet, even as he works, you notice garlic hanging in braids from his workshop rafters, and tucked behind his mixing table is a basket of fresh bulbs. This reveals something crucial. Perfume wasn't absent from all medieval weddings, but its presence was deeply suspicious, potentially dangerous. A spiritual risk that had to be carefully managed. The merchant's daughter will wear perfume at her wedding because social status demands it. Appearing at a noble Venetian wedding smelling of garlic alone would be humiliating, a sign of peasant origins, and admission of poverty. But she'll also carry garlic, hidden in sachets sewn into her elaborate silk gown, because perfume without garlic was suicidal foolishness, an invitation to demonic attention that no amount of social pressure could justify. The theological problem with perfume ran deeper than simple suspicion of luxury. Medieval Christianity inherited from classical philosophy the idea that demons operated partly through deception. They appeared beautiful to tempt humans, disguised corruption as pleasure, made evil attractive through sensory manipulation. Perfume fit perfectly into this framework. It masked natural smells, created artificial pleasantness, deceived the nose about reality. A perfumed woman was literally surrounded by deception, wrapped in olfactory lies that made her body smell like something it wasn't. And if demons were masters of deception, then perfume created the perfect environment for them, a cloud of false scent that they could hide within, use as camouflage, exploit as entry point. Church fathers wrote extensively about the spiritual dangers of perfume. Saint Jerome, whose writings remained influential throughout the medieval period, warned that women who perfume themselves attract not only the attention of men but of demons who delight in artifice. A 12th century sermon by Bernard of Clairvaux specifically addresses wedding perfume, arguing that brides should appear before God in their natural condition, not disguised by foreign scents that obscure their true nature from divine sight. The concern wasn't just moral, it was practical theology about how spiritual entities interacted with human souls, and perfume supposedly disrupted that interaction in dangerous ways. You watch the Venetian bride try on her perfume, dabbing it on her wrists and neck, and the perfumer immediately reaches for his garlic basket. "You'll need these as well," he says, not as suggestion but as dire warning. He's seen what happens when noble brides ignore protective traditions in favour of pure luxury. He doesn't elaborate on what he's seen, but his expression suggests genuine tragedy. Deaths, madness, marriages that failed catastrophically. He wraps garlic cloves in silk cloth, making them more acceptable to wealthy clients. But the protection remains unchanged regardless of packaging. The aristocratic solution to the perfume problem was layering, wearing perfume for social reasons but surrounding it with protective elements that theoretically neutralize the danger. A noble bride might wear perfume on her skin but garlic in her hair, creating olfactory zones where different substances dominated, or perfume on her dress but garlic against her body underneath, prioritizing protection for her actual physical form while allowing social performance at a distance. The result was contradictory, confusing sensory experiences where sweet and pungent competed, sometimes within inches of each other. Historians still argue whether these perfumed yet garlicked noble brides genuinely believed in the danger or simply performed both traditions to satisfy different constituencies: church officials who demanded garlic, social circles that expected perfume. But the expense involved in both suggests real conviction. Perfume was costly, garlic was cheap. If nobles were spending money on both, maintaining traditions that partially contradicted each other, the belief probably ran deep enough to override simple pragmatism. Some perfumers specialized in protected perfumes, scents that included garlic or other defensive elements directly in the formulation, attempting to create fragrances that were both socially acceptable and supernaturally safe. These experimental perfumes often smelled bizarre. Rose and garlic, jasmine and onion, musk and crushed herbs. But they sold well to clients who wanted both luxury and protection. A few perfumers claimed to have discovered the perfect balance, secret formulas that made garlic's scent pleasant rather than pungent. But these claims were generally received with skepticism. Protection that smelled good was probably protection that didn't work. The deeper issue was that pleasantness itself was suspect. If something smelled too good, felt too pleasurable, created too much sensory delight, medieval theology suggested it was probably sinful or dangerous or both. Perfume represented pleasure for its own sake, beauty detached from function, luxury that served no purpose except enjoyment, all categories that Christianity viewed with suspicion. Garlic, by contrast, was unpleasant but functional, harsh but honest, aggressive but protective. The contrast between perfume and garlic mapped onto broader medieval tensions between pleasure and duty, luxury and necessity, appearance and reality. You notice something else in the perfumer's workshop. A painting on the wall showing St. Mary Magdalene, the reformed prostitute, and she's depicted pouring perfume on Christ's feet. This biblical story about perfume being used in holy service should theoretically rehabilitate perfume's spiritual reputation, but medieval interpretation was complicated. Some theologians argued the story showed perfume could be redeemed through proper use, applied to Christ rather than used for seduction. Others pointed out that Mary Magdalene was a repentant sinner, and her perfume represented her sinful past that she was symbolically pouring out in repentance. The perfume in the story was valuable but also tainted, precious but problematic, much like perfume at weddings. The Venetian bride makes her decision. She'll wear both perfume and garlic, managing the contradiction through careful spatial arrangement and trusting that the garlic will override any demonic attraction created by the perfume. This compromise was common among nobility, who couldn't abandon perfume without losing social standing, but couldn't abandon garlic without risking supernatural catastrophe. They lived in both worlds simultaneously, the world of luxury and social performance where perfume mattered, and the world of spiritual threat where only garlic provided real safety. As the bride leaves the perfumer's workshop carrying both her expensive scent and her humble protective bulbs, you understand why this contradiction persisted. Medieval life was full of competing demands, social expectations versus spiritual requirements, wealth display versus religious humility, pleasure versus safety. The perfumed yet garliced bride embodied these tensions physically, wearing them on her body, carrying them into her wedding, trying to satisfy both human society and supernatural realities, hoping that somehow both perfume and garlic could coexist without cancelling each other out. Whether this actually worked, whether demons were fooled, deterred, or simply didn't exist, nobody could prove definitively. But the fact that brides continued using both, generation after generation, spending money and effort on seemingly contradictory protections, suggests the fear was real enough that hedging bets seemed like the only rational strategy in an uncertain, dangerous world where invisible threats lurked behind every pleasant smell. You enter the great hall where the wedding feast is finally beginning, and the first thing that hits you isn't the sight of decorated tables or the sound of musicians tuning their instruments. It's the smell. Overwhelming, inescapable garlic that permeates every dish being carried from the kitchen. This isn't accidental seasoning or culinary preference. This is deliberate, systematic, ritualized consumption of protection, a communal meal where every single course contains garlic and every guest becomes a participant in the bride's defense whether they realize it or not. The tables are laid out in a U shape, with the bride and groom seated at the center of the high table where everyone can see them. You notice the serving staff bringing out the first course, a pottage, a thick stew of vegetables and grains swimming in broth that reeks of crushed garlic. Medieval feasts typically progress through multiple courses, sometimes lasting 6 or 7 hours, and at this wedding every course will feature garlic in some form. The pottage is followed by roasted fowl, chickens and geese rubbed inside and out with garlic paste before roasting, then fish poached in wine and garlic, then pork sausages mixed with so much garlic that the meat is barely visible, then vegetables, turnips, cabbage, carrots, all cooked in garlic-infused fats. The feast isn't just feeding guests, it's creating a collective protective barrier. The theory, as you piece it together from conversations around the tables, is that if everyone eats garlic, everyone becomes temporarily protected, and this collective protection reinforces the bride and groom's individual defenses. It's spiritual mathematics. One person carrying garlic might repel one demon, but 100 people all reeking of garlic creates a force field that even multiple demons working together can't penetrate. The wedding feast transforms from celebration into ritual fortification, from social gathering into defensive strategy. You watch guests eating and their reactions vary. Some people clearly enjoy garlic, reaching for seconds, sopping up garlic-heavy sauces with bread. Others struggle, forcing down mouthfuls of pungent food because refusing to eat would be interpreted not just as rudeness, but as abandoning their protective duty toward the married couple. A visiting merchant from a region where garlic isn't traditional wedding food looks vaguely ill after the 4th garlic-dominated course, but he keeps eating because social pressure and supernatural duty both demand it. His discomfort is noticed but not accommodated. The protection matters more than his personal preferences. The kitchen staff prepared for days for this feast, and you slip back to see the scale of garlic use. Baskets and baskets of bulbs, hundreds of cloves peeled and crushed, whole heads roasted until soft and sweet, garlic incorporated into literally every dish including the desserts. Yes, desserts. You see honey cakes that include garlic powder in the spiced flour, fruit compotes cooked with garlic-infused honey. Even the ale served throughout the feast has been flavoured with garlic during brewing. Nothing escapes. Every taste carries protection. Every swallow reinforces the defensive barrier. Historians still argue whether medieval people genuinely enjoyed these garlic-saturated feasts, or simply endured them as necessary ritual, but recipe collections from the period suggest both operated simultaneously. Some medieval cookbooks include elaborate garlic-based dishes described in terms that suggest culinary pleasure, a most savoury preparation, or much beloved by discerning palates. Other recipes are purely medicinal in tone, to be consumed at weddings for protection of the married parties. The line between medicine and cuisine was blurry in medieval cooking anyway, with most ingredients understood to have both nutritional and medicinal spiritual properties. The communal eating also served social functions beyond supernatural protection. Sharing food created bonds, and sharing specifically protective food created protective bonds. Every guest who ate garlic at this wedding became spiritually invested in the marriage's success. They'd consumed the same protection, participated in the same ritual, made themselves temporary extensions of the couple's defensive network. If the marriage failed despite these precautions, the failure implicated everyone who attended and ate, suggesting either that the garlic wasn't strong enough or that someone hadn't consumed enough, or that a guest with malicious intent had somehow sabotaged the collective protection. This social pressure meant that wedding feasts were remarkably well attended. Refusing an invitation wasn't just socially awkward, it suggested you didn't want to participate in protecting the marriage, which raised questions about your intentions. Were you hoping the marriage would fail? Did you harbour jealousy or resentment? Were you perhaps in league with demonic forces? The paranoia could escalate quickly in communities where supernatural threats were taken seriously, and the simplest way to avoid suspicion was to attend the feast and eat garlic conspicuously, demonstrating your support and protective contribution. You watch a woman at the lower tables who's clearly pregnant, and she's eating more garlic than anyone else, piling it onto her trencher, requesting extra portions from servants. Pregnant women at wedding feasts carried double duty. They needed to protect themselves and their unborn children, who were especially vulnerable to demonic interference, and they also contributed more protective power because they contained two souls rather than one. A pregnant guest was valued, her presence actively sought, and she was often seated near the bride specifically so her enhanced protective capacity would radiate toward the most vulnerable person in the room. The feast progresses through hours, and the garlic consumption becomes almost competitive. You hear guests boasting about how much they've eaten, comparing their tolerance, demonstrating their commitment to the couple's protection through sheer volume of garlic consumed. This turns deadly serious ritual into something approaching social game, but the underlying purpose remains constant. Every clove eaten is another layer of defense, another increment of protection, another small action that might mean the difference between successful marriage and supernatural catastrophe. Do you remember the bride sitting at the high table? She's eating garlic too, despite already carrying it, wearing it, surrounding herself with it. She consumes every garlic dish that's served, participating fully in the communal protection, even though she's the person being protected. This sends a message. She's not passively accepting others' defense, but actively contributing to her own protection, taking responsibility for her spiritual safety, while also accepting the community's help. It's a delicate balance of dependence and agency, vulnerability and strength. As the feast continues deep into evening, the hall fills with the concentrated smell of 100 people, all breathing garlic-scented breath, all sweating garlic-infused sweat, all radiating protection through their pores and exhalations. Modern people would find this atmosphere revolting, possibly nauseating. But in medieval understanding, this was the smell of successful community action, of collective defense, of a village or town coming together to protect two of its members during their most vulnerable transition. The garlic smell became proof of love. Not romantic love, but communal love, the kind that said, "We will eat unpleasant food and endure uncomfortable smells because protecting you matters more than our comfort." The final course arrives, roasted pears baked with garlic and cinnamon, and as guests finish this last sweet savoury dish, they're sent home with small bundles of garlic to take with them. This extends the protection beyond the feast, allowing guests to carry the wedding's defensive power back to their own households, spreading protection outward like ripples from a stone thrown into water. The wedding feast doesn't end when people leave. It persists in their bodies, their breath, their homes, maintaining connection and protection for days afterward, until the garlic finally fades from systems and houses and everyone returns to normal life. The dangerous transition successfully completed, the couple safely married, the community having done everything possible to ensure that love, or at least economic partnership, survived against invisible forces that wanted nothing more than to see it fail. You're moving forward through time now, watching centuries pass like pages turning in a book, and somewhere around the year 1520, you notice something shifting. The garlic crowns are appearing less frequently. The elaborate blessing rituals are becoming simpler. A bride in Florence carries roses alongside her garlic, and while her grandmother watches with disapproval, no one else seems particularly concerned. The Renaissance is arriving, bringing with it new ideas about the world, about humanity, about the nature of threats both visible and invisible, and the garlic is beginning its slow, uneven fade from wedding ceremonies. The change doesn't happen suddenly or uniformly. It's more like fog lifting from a landscape, clearing in patches, lingering in valleys while dissipating from hilltops. Urban areas shift first. You're in London around 1580, watching a merchant-class wedding, and the bride carries a small nosegay of flowers and herbs that includes garlic, but hides it among lavender and rosemary, making the protective element decorative rather than dominant. The garlic is still there, still serving its supposed function, but it's no longer the centerpiece, no longer the obvious, overwhelming feature it was 2 centuries earlier. Social attitudes are transforming, and carrying obvious garlic is starting to seem rustic, old-fashioned, a practice for country folk who haven't absorbed more sophisticated urban sensibilities. Educational developments contributed to this shift. As literacy spread and printed books became more available, medical knowledge began displacing folk beliefs, slowly, incompletely, but perceptibly. Anatomical understanding improved. Disease mechanisms were being studied more systematically, even if germ theory wouldn't emerge for centuries yet. The idea that illness came from miasma and demonic attack was being challenged by physicians who proposed more naturalistic explanations. And if disease didn't come from demons, then perhaps weddings weren't supernatural battlegrounds after all, and garlic was just a plant with culinary and medicinal uses rather than a weapon against invisible enemies. The Protestant Reformation accelerated changes in some regions while preserving traditions in others. You watch a Lutheran wedding in Germany around 1560, and the Protestant pastor refuses to bless garlic, calling it Catholic superstition mixed with paganism. Faith in Christ alone provides protection, he thunders from the pulpit. External objects have no spiritual power. To believe otherwise is idolatry. Some brides and families accept this theological position, abandoning garlic as incompatible with Reformed Christianity. Others simply hide their garlic, carrying it covertly, unwilling to abandon protection that generations of ancestors trusted even if their new religion discouraged it. Historians still argue about whether Reformation theology truly reduced belief in demons at weddings or simply changed how that belief was expressed. But wedding records show declining references to protective rituals in Protestant regions during the 16th and 17th centuries. Catholic regions maintained traditions longer. The Church's official position on garlic remained ambiguous, neither fully endorsing nor completely condemning, allowing regional variation to persist. An Italian Catholic bride in 1620 might carry garlic openly with full priestly blessing, while her English Protestant contemporary would carry flowers and perhaps hide a single garlic clove in her pocket, a compromise between old beliefs and new theology. Economic changes mattered too. As trade expanded and wealth increased among merchant classes, weddings became more elaborate social performances where aesthetic considerations competed with protective concerns. You're at a wealthy Amsterdam wedding in 1640, and the bride's dress is expensive silk imported from China. Her jewellery is gold and pearls, and her bouquet is an artfully arranged collection of exotic flowers that cost more than most workers earned annually. There's no visible garlic. Does this mean she's unprotected? You notice her mother watching anxiously, and later you discover garlic sewn into the dress lining, hidden but present, protection maintained privately while public presentation focused on beauty and status. The slow fade of garlic traditions also reflected changing marriage patterns. As romantic love became more culturally valued, not universal yet, but increasingly promoted in literature, theatre, and popular culture, weddings began to emphasize emotional connection rather than pure economic transaction. When marriage became about love, the supernatural threats seemed less pressing, or at least less specific to weddings in particular. If daily life with your beloved was what mattered rather than just the dangerous transition moment, then perhaps everyday faith and virtue provided sufficient protection, and special wedding garlic became less necessary. Rural areas maintained traditions far longer than cities. You're in a remote Scottish village in 1750, and the garlic wedding customs look almost unchanged from medieval practices. Crowns, bundles, feast integration, the whole protective system still operating at full intensity. Geographic isolation preserved beliefs and practices that urban areas had abandoned generations earlier. These rural communities had less access to new ideas, less exposure to different perspectives, and perhaps more importantly, less reason to change. If garlic weddings had worked for centuries, if marriages endured, children were born, families prospered, why abandon a successful formula because city dwellers developed new fashions? Class differences became more pronounced. Aristocratic and upper-class weddings increasingly featured no garlic at all, treating the old customs as peasant superstition beneath their dignity. Middle-class weddings showed the most variation, some families clinging to tradition, others abandoning it, many attempting various compromises. Lower-class and peasant weddings kept garlic longest, partly because tradition held strongest in less educated populations, but also because garlic was cheap. When you couldn't afford elaborate weddings with expensive flowers and luxuries, garlic remained available, familiar, traditional, and free, or nearly so. The protective logic might have been fading, but the practical affordability ensured garlic remained present in poorer weddings long after wealthier brides had replaced it with roses. The Enlightenment of the 18th century struck another blow against wedding garlic. Rationalist philosophy dismissed supernatural beliefs as ignorance, and intellectuals actively campaigned against folk practices they viewed as primitive holdovers from less enlightened eras. A French philosophe, writing in 1760, mocked wedding garlic as evidence of the profound ignorance that characterized our ancestors, who attributed to vegetables the power to combat imaginary beings. This contemptuous dismissal became fashionable in educated circles, creating social pressure against practices that marked practitioners as backward, uneducated, embarrassingly traditional. Yet you notice something interesting. Even as garlic faded from weddings, the superstitions around weddings didn't disappear, they just transformed. New traditions emerged that served similar psychological functions. Brides began wearing veils to ward off evil eye, carrying something old, new borrowed blue for luck, throwing bouquets to transfer good fortune, avoiding the groom before the ceremony to prevent bad luck. The specific practice of carrying garlic declined, but the underlying belief that weddings required special protections, that transitions were dangerous, that rituals could defend against misfortune, all of this persisted, simply changing its symbols and expressions. By 1800, garlic at weddings had become rare in Western Europe except in isolated rural communities. An English guidebook on proper wedding etiquette from 1823 mentions garlic only to explicitly forbid it, as a vulgar and outdated custom unsuitable for persons of refinement. The same guidebook recommends carrying orange blossoms for purity and white roses for virtue. Different symbols, different meanings, but still objects carried by brides for purposes beyond mere decoration. The impulse to ritualize, to protect, to mark the wedding as special and potentially dangerous remained constant even as the specific tools changed. Do you remember that medieval bride clutching her garlic bundle with white-knuckled fear? By the early 19th century, her descendants were carrying flowers with relaxed hands, smiling for the new technology of photography, entering marriages that emphasized romantic love over economic transaction. The visible terror had faded. The garlic was gone, but if you looked closely at those Victorian brides, you'd still see anxiety in their eyes, still hear echoes of old warnings in the advice they received, still recognize in their elaborate rituals and carefully followed traditions the same human need for control, for protection, for some defense, any defense, against the uncertainties of marriage and the unknown future, even if that defense now came wrapped in silk ribbons rather than pungent bulbs. You're standing now in a world where garlic has supposedly vanished from weddings, but if you look more carefully, if you listen to whispered conversations in immigrant communities and watch traditional ceremonies that happen away from mainstream attention, you discover something surprising. The garlic never completely disappeared. It went underground, transformed, adapted, became coded and camouflaged. But it persisted in ways that reveal how deeply these protective instincts run in human consciousness, how reluctant people are to abandon defenses even when rational thought says those defenses were never necessary. Start with the shoes. You're at a medieval wedding, and you notice the bride is wearing her shoes backward, left foot in right shoe and vice versa. This looks uncomfortable and impractical, and it is. But discomfort is the point. Demons supposedly tracked humans by their footprints, following the distinctive pattern each person left in dirt or snow. Wearing shoes backward created confusing tracks that demons couldn't interpret. The prints suggested someone walking in the opposite direction, leading supernatural pursuers away from the bride rather than toward her. This practice continued in parts of rural Europe into the 19th century, a non-garlic protection that served similar defensive purposes. You watch another bride step over a threshold and someone has scattered salt instead of garlic. Salt had protective properties similar to garlic in folk belief. It was purifying, preserving, resistant to corruption, and its crystalline structure supposedly trapped evil spirits. As garlic became socially unacceptable at upper-class weddings, salt substituted, performing the same protective function with less offensive smell and more classical pedigree. Salt appears in biblical texts as symbol of covenant and preservation. The substitution allowed continued protection while appearing more religiously orthodox and socially refined. Then there's the iron. You notice a Scottish bride from the 1700s carrying a small iron horseshoe in her bouquet, hidden among flowers. Iron was ancient protection against fairies and malevolent supernatural beings. Cold iron was believed toxic to non-human entities, creating barriers they couldn't cross. In regions where Celtic folklore remained strong, iron replaced or supplemented garlic as wedding protection. Some families forged special wedding nails that brides carried in pockets, or iron keys threaded on ribbons and worn as bracelets. Different material, identical purpose, creating a barrier between the vulnerable bride and invisible threats. Fire leaping was another substitute protection. You're at a rural wedding in Eastern Europe around 1680, and before entering her new household, the bride must jump over a small fire built at the threshold. Fire purified, burned away spiritual contamination, prevented evil from following the bride into her marriage. This practice was dramatic, slightly dangerous. Brides occasionally caught their skirts on fire, requiring quick action from guests with water buckets. But the risk was considered worthwhile because fire provided protection that worked through different mechanisms than garlic. Where garlic repelled through smell, fire purified through heat and light, burning away evil rather than driving it away. Historians still argue whether these alternative protections developed because garlic became unfashionable, or whether they existed alongside garlic all along, and simply became more visible when garlic use declined. But the effect was similar. Weddings remained protected through various means even as specific methods changed. The underlying anxiety about supernatural threats during transitions persisted long after Enlightenment rationality supposedly eliminated such superstitions. Some protections became more subtle, coded into wedding customs in ways that obscured their original protective purposes. The wedding veil, which became nearly universal in Western weddings during the Victorian era, originally served protective functions. It hid the bride's face from demons and evil eye, creating a physical barrier between her vulnerable identity and supernatural observation. By the 19th century, the veil was explained as symbol of modesty or purity, but its protective origins remained embedded in the practice. Brides still wore veils, still covered their faces during the most vulnerable moments of the ceremony, still enacted protective rituals even while claiming those rituals were merely decorative or symbolic. The threshold carrying tradition, grooms carrying brides over thresholds, has similar protective origins that got romantically reinterpreted. Thresholds were dangerous liminal spaces where evil congregated. A bride stepping over a threshold on her own feet risked supernatural interference at the moment of crossing. Being carried over elevated her above the threshold plane, allowing her to bypass the dangerous zone without direct contact. Medieval and early modern wedding records explicitly mention this protective purpose, but by the Victorian era it was explained as romantic gesture or symbol of the groom's strength. The practice continued. The explanation changed. You notice wedding cakes appearing with elaborate decoration, and hidden within the tradition is another protective element. Early wedding cakes often contained protective ingredients: honey for sweetness that attracted good fortune, spices like cinnamon and cloves that had protective reputations similar to garlic, sometimes even small amounts of garlic powder mixed into spiced cake recipes where it wouldn't be identifiable by taste. As cakes became more refined and recipes more standardized, these protective ingredients disappeared, but the idea that wedding cake had special properties persisted. Eating wedding cake brought luck, preserving a piece brought blessings, sharing cake with guests created protective bonds. The specific mechanism changed, but the protective function remained. Then there's the rice throwing. You're at a late 19th century wedding, and guests throw rice at the departing couple. The modern explanation claims this symbolizes fertility, wishing the couple many children, but older sources reveal additional purposes. Scattered grain supposedly distracted evil spirits, who would stop to count every grain before continuing their pursuit, and counting took so long that the couple escaped. This counting compulsion of demons appears in folklore worldwide, and using grain to exploit this weakness was common protective strategy. The rice created a defensive barrier through demonic obsessive-compulsive behavior, a very different mechanism than garlic's repellent smell but serving identical protective purpose. Wedding rings themselves absorbed protective meanings. The circular shape, like garlic crowns, had no beginning or end, creating unbroken barriers that evil couldn't penetrate. Rings were worn on the fourth finger of the left hand because medieval anatomy believed a vein ran directly from that finger to the heart. The ring thus protected the heart, the seat of emotion and life, from direct demonic attack. Gold was used not just for value but because gold didn't corrode or tarnish, remaining pure like the protection it symbolized. The romantic interpretations of wedding rings, eternal love, unbroken commitment, layered over, but didn't completely replace these older protective meanings. You watch a Jewish wedding where the couple stands under a chuppah, a ceremonial canopy, and this too serves protective functions beyond its religious symbolism. The canopy creates a defined sacred space, a temporary sanctuary where the couple is sheltered during their vulnerable transition. The four posts represent divine protection from all directions, and the open sides allow good spirits and blessings to enter, while the canopy itself shields against evil from above. Different cultural expression, but you recognize the same impulse, using physical structures and ritual objects to create defended space during weddings, acknowledging that the transition requires extra protection, even if modern participants can't articulate exactly what they're being protected from. Do you remember the garlic-crowned Polish bride? Her descendant in 1920s Chicago might carry a bouquet of white roses and baby's breath with no visible garlic anywhere. But if you look closely at the ribbon binding the bouquet, you might notice a single small clove tucked into the binding, hidden from view but present. Or garlic might be rubbed onto the bride's shoes where no one will see it. Or a tiny sachet of garlic pinned inside the dress where it presses against her skin. The protection moved from public display to private gesture, from obvious to subtle, from central to peripheral, but it didn't vanish completely. It just learned to hide, adapting to new social contexts while maintaining its ancient purpose, protecting brides who might not even consciously believe in demons, but who weren't quite willing to risk entering marriage completely undefended, just in case their ancestors were right about the invisible dangers lurking in moments of transition. You step into the present now, into the 21st century, into a world of electric lights and smartphones and couples who meet on dating apps and plan Pinterest-perfect weddings with color-coordinated aesthetics and hashtags for guests to use when posting photos. Garlic at weddings seems impossibly distant, a bizarre medieval practice that belongs in history books, not modern ceremonies. And yet, if you know where to look, if you attend the right weddings, if you listen to the right grandmothers giving advice to brides, you discover that echoes persist, faint but unmistakable, whispers of ancient protections that refuse to die completely, even in our supposedly rational age. You're at an Italian-American wedding in New Jersey, and during the reception the bride's nonna pulls her aside and presses something into her hand, a tiny cloth pouch that smells unmistakably of garlic. "Keep this with you tonight," the grandmother whispers in Italian-accented English. "Your great-grandmother carried it. Your grandmother carried it. Your mother carried it on her wedding night. It's tradition." The bride looks embarrassed, glancing around to make sure no one overheard, but she doesn't refuse the pouch. She tucks it into her clutch, this sleek modern bride with her professionally styled hair and designer gown, carrying garlic into her wedding night exactly like brides did 600 years ago. The transmission of these traditions happens quietly now, in private conversations between generations, in family kitchens rather than public ceremonies. A Polish grandmother in Chicago teaches her granddaughter to braid garlic, even though the girl will carry a bouquet of peonies at her wedding. But you keep this in your car, at the reception venue, just in case. But here, just in case of what? The grandmother doesn't specify, and the granddaughter doesn't ask, but both understand there are protections you maintain even when you can't rationally explain why they matter. You're at a Greek Orthodox wedding, and the priest blesses a dish of koufeta, sugar-coated almonds given to guests, but the bride's aunt has added crushed garlic to the rice being thrown at the couple, mixing old protective elements with newer traditions. No one mentions this publicly. The official program doesn't note it, but several older women at the wedding notice and nod approvingly, recognizing the continuation of practices their own mothers and grandmothers maintained. Eastern European communities preserved garlic traditions most openly. You're at a Ukrainian wedding in Toronto where the wedding bread, the korovai, is made with a recipe that includes garlic powder mixed into the dough, not enough to taste distinctly, but present nonetheless, baked into the ceremonial food that the couple will share during the reception. When asked, the baker who made the bread explains it's for health or for good luck. Vague modern explanations that don't mention demons or supernatural protection, but the practice continues, passed down through family lines, maintained because abandoning it feels risky even if no one can articulate the specific risk. Historians studying contemporary wedding practices have documented persistent folk customs that participants often can't fully explain. They do things because their mothers did them, because it's tradition, because it brings good luck, or keeps away bad energy. Sat. The language has changed. Demons became bad energy. Supernatural protection became positive vibes. Garlic's power is explained through natural antibacterial properties, but the structural similarity to medieval practices is remarkable. Modern brides still seek protection during weddings, still perform rituals meant to defend their marriages, still carry or consume specific substances believed to have protective properties. The wellness culture of recent decades created unexpected space for garlic's return. Though stripped of explicit supernatural context, you're at a wedding where the reception menu features immunity-boosting dishes heavy with garlic, explained through nutritional science. Garlic's allicin content supports immune function, reduces inflammation, promotes cardiovascular health. None of this is false, but you notice the bride's mother specifically requesting garlic in every course, and when pressed, she admits her own mother did the same thing for protection. Protection from what? Just protection, she says, and won't elaborate further. Some modern couples deliberately revive historical traditions as aesthetic choices. You're at a medieval-themed wedding, where the bride carries a historically researched garlic bundle as authenticity detail, photographed extensively for her Instagram feed. She doesn't believe in demons. She's a software engineer with a graduate degree, but she finds the tradition cool and unique, harvesting its visual distinctiveness while discarding its original purpose. The garlic is present but emptied of meaning, transformed into costume rather than protection. Yet even here, you notice her grandmother watching with an expression that suggests she takes the garlic more seriously than her granddaughter does, interpreting the revival through older frameworks where garlic matters regardless of the carrier's belief. Folklore collectors and anthropologists have documented continuing garlic wedding traditions in rural areas of Eastern Europe, parts of Italy, some regions of Latin America, where European customs merged with indigenous practices. A Roma wedding in Romania still features elaborate garlic rituals, with brides wearing garlic crowns and the entire community consuming garlic-heavy feasts, exactly as medieval Europeans did. These aren't historical reenactments. They're living traditions maintained in communities where modernity has arrived but hasn't completely displaced older worldviews. where belief in evil eye and supernatural threats persists alongside smartphones and satellite television. You notice something interesting about who maintains these traditions most strongly. Often immigrants, diaspora communities, people who've experienced displacement or cultural disruption. Carrying garlic to weddings became a way of maintaining cultural identity, connecting to ancestral homelands, asserting continuity with the past. A bride whose grandparents fled war or persecution might carry hidden garlic as an act of defiance against cultural erasure, a declaration that old ways still matter, that protection passed down through generations still has value, even if the exact nature of the threat has changed. The COVID-19 pandemic created unexpected moments where garlic's protective reputation resurfaced. During 2020 and 2021, when small weddings happened despite restrictions, some families incorporated garlic more openly, partly as folk remedy against respiratory illness, partly as psychological comfort during frightening times, partly as acknowledgement that invisible threats were real and traditional protections felt appropriate again. Several wedding planners reported brides requesting garlic in bouquets or reception decor, explaining they wanted all the protection possible during uncertain times. The specific threat was viral rather than demonic, but the impulse was identical, using garlic to defend against invisible dangers during vulnerable transitions. Social media has created new spaces for these traditions to persist and spread. You're scrolling through wedding hashtags and discover a thread where Italian-American brides discuss their nonna's garlic traditions, sharing photos of tiny protective pouches, comparing family-specific rituals, laughing but also seriously debating whether to continue practices they were raised with. The tone is ambivalent, simultaneously ironic and sincere, making fun of superstition while also admitting, I'm probably going to do it anyway just to be safe. The hedge their bets approach is remarkably similar to medieval compromise. You don't fully believe, but you're not willing to risk being wrong. Do you remember that medieval English bride with her wilted garlic bundle? Her descendant today might be getting married in a minimalist venue with Edison bulbs and succulents, wearing a dress from Balden, serving craft cocktails and farm-to-table appetizers, documenting everything for social media. Garlic isn't visible anywhere in the carefully curated aesthetic, but in the getting-ready room, her Italian grandmother or Polish aunt or Greek mother might quietly press a small clove into her hand with a meaningful look, and the bride, this thoroughly modern woman, might laugh awkwardly but still tuck that clove into her bouquet or her shoe or somewhere on her person, carrying it through the ceremony and reception, maintaining a protection she doesn't quite believe in but isn't quite willing to abandon, hedging ancient bets against invisible threats that probably don't exist but possibly might, honouring ancestors who knew things we've forgotten, keeping faith with grandmothers who kept faith with their grandmothers, stretching back through centuries of brides who all face the same fundamental uncertainty. Marriage is transition. Transition is dangerous. Protection matters. And garlic, strange as it seems, is protection that has worked, or at least hasn't failed for thousands of years. And maybe that's reason enough to keep carrying it, keep hiding it. Keep whispering about it to the next generation of brides who will roll their eyes and laugh and then quietly, privately, continue the tradition anyway. You're drifting now, floating between past and present, watching the long thread of garlic-carrying brides stretch across centuries, and you feel yourself beginning to settle, to slow, to soften into the quiet understanding that comes at the end of long journeys through history. The medieval chapel with its pungent air feels distant now, separated by 800 years of brides who carried protection in forms both obvious and hidden, who faced their fears with whatever tools their cultures provided, who married despite uncertainty and danger, and the persistent human anxiety that transitions between life stages invite catastrophe. Think about what you've witnessed, not just the garlic itself, but what it represented, the human impulse it served. Every bride across these centuries, whether crowned with 40 garlic bulbs or hiding a single clove in her pocket, was trying to answer the same unanswerable question. How do you protect something as fragile as hope, as vulnerable as love, as uncertain as a newly formed marriage from all the forces that might destroy it? Medieval people answered with garlic because garlic was available, traditional, believed to work. Modern people answer with prenuptial agreements, couples therapy, wedding insurance, differently shaped protections for differently conceptualized threats. But the impulse remains constant, the need to defend something precious during its most vulnerable moment. The garlic traditions remind you that human consciousness hasn't changed as much as we sometimes think. Medieval people weren't fundamentally different from us. They feared the unknown, they tried to control the uncontrollable, they performed rituals that made them feel safer even when rational analysis couldn't confirm those rituals actually worked. We do the same things, just with different vocabulary. We talk about protecting our energy instead of warding off demons. We carry something old, something new, instead of garlic crowns. We throw rice or birdseed instead of scattering garlic cloves at thresholds. The specific practices evolve, but the psychological need they serve, the need for agency, for defense, for hope that our actions matter against forces larger than ourselves, that need transcend centuries and cultures. You think about all the bridesmaids who served as decoys, the priests who blessed garlic despite theological reservations, the grandmothers who taught protective rituals to granddaughters, the perfumers who tried to create safe luxury, the feast guests who ate pungent food as acts of communal protection. All of these people were participating in collective attempts to shield brides during dangerous transitions, and while the specific danger they feared, demonic attack, may not have been real in the way they imagined, the vulnerability they recognized was genuine. Marriage is transformation, and transformation is always somewhat dangerous, always involves risk, always creates moments where you don't quite know who you're becoming or how the story will end. The garlic couldn't actually stop demons, because demons, as medieval people understood them, probably didn't exist in the first place. But the garlic did something else. It provided comfort, created community, gave people tools for expressing care and concern, allowed them to take action instead of passively accepting fate. A bride carrying garlic felt defended rather than helpless, supported rather than alone, connected to generations of women who face similar transitions with similar fears. The garlic's power wasn't supernatural, it was psychological, social, emotional. It worked not because it repelled demons, but because it strengthened humans. And perhaps that was always the real magic. You're settling deeper now into that drowsy state where thoughts become less distinct, where the boundaries between medieval chapels and modern wedding venues blur and blend, where all the brides across all the centuries merge into a single continuous procession of women moving toward uncertain futures with whatever protection they could gather. The smell of garlic fades into the smell of roses, of incense, of perfume, of nothing in particular, just the vague, pleasant scent of sleep approaching, of consciousness loosening its grip, of the day's thoughts dissolving into the formless drift that precedes dreams. Somewhere in your dimming awareness, you understand that this story about garlic weddings was never really about garlic at all. It was about fear and hope existing simultaneously, about humans trying to protect joy in a world full of threats, about traditions that persist because they serve needs deeper than their surface explanations suggest. It was about continuity and change, about practices that transform but don't disappear, about grandmothers and granddaughters sharing secret protections across generational divides, about the enduring human conviction that some transitions require extra care, extra ritual, extra protection, even if we can't quite explain why. The medieval bride with her garlic bundle and the modern bride with her carefully curated aesthetic are the same woman, separated by time but united by the vulnerability of standing at a threshold between old life and new, facing the unknown, hoping that whatever protections they've gathered, garlic or good luck or God or simply love itself, will prove sufficient to carry them safely through. Both brides are afraid and hopeful simultaneously. Both perform rituals that matter more than logic can explain. Both become part of that long procession of humans marking important transitions with ceremonies that say, "This moment matters. This change is significant. This passage deserves protection and witness and whatever magic we can muster." Your thoughts are softening now, becoming less like thoughts and more like feelings, less like analysis and more like acceptance. The gentle recognition that history is full of people who faced their fears with the tools available to them, who did their best with what they had, who protected what they loved however they could. The garlic-carrying brides deserve not mockery for their superstition, but respect for their courage, their creativity, their refusal to face danger passively, their insistence that human action mattered even against threats they couldn't see or prove or fully understand. The story is ending now, or perhaps just fading, the way all stories eventually fade into the quiet spaces of memory and sleep. The medieval chapel is empty, the feast hall is dark, the brides have all gone home to their marriages, some successful, some tragic, most somewhere in between, just like marriages always are regardless of garlic or lack thereof. The protection worked, or it didn't. The demons came, or they didn't. The marriages endured, or they didn't. And life continued the way life continues, resilient and fragile simultaneously, protected and vulnerable, full of fear and hope braided together like garlic crowns woven with red thread. You're barely aware now of the boundary between waking and sleeping, barely holding on to the thread of this story about medieval brides and pungent protection. The garlic smell has completely faded, replaced by nothing in particular, just the neutral scent of your own bedroom, your own pillow, your own comfortable, familiar space where history feels very far away and sleep feels very close. The brides are still processing somewhere in your dimming consciousness, still carrying their garlic, still hoping their protections prove sufficient, still moving forward into uncertain futures, because that's what humans do. We move forward, we protect what we can. We hope despite uncertainty. We perform our rituals and trust they mean something even when we can't prove it. And perhaps that's enough. Perhaps it was always enough. Not the garlic itself, but the act of carrying it. Not the protection, but the effort to protect. Not the certainty of safety, but the refusal to surrender to fear without resistance. The medieval brides understood something we still understand. That transitions are dangerous and precious simultaneously, that hope requires defending, that love needs protecting, and that whatever tools we have, however strange they might seem to outsiders, if they help us face the unknown with courage rather than paralyzing fear, then they're serving their purpose, they're doing their work, they're enough. The story ends here, in this quiet space between waking and sleep, between medieval chapels and modern bedrooms, between fear and hope, between danger and safety, between the world where demons lurk at wedding thresholds and the world where nothing supernatural threatens us but vulnerability remains real nonetheless. The garlic has done its work, not protecting medieval brides from demons perhaps, but protecting all of us from the more subtle demon of helplessness, giving us evidence that humans have always found ways to defend what matters, to protect transitions, to mark important moments with rituals that say, I acknowledge this is dangerous and I choose to proceed anyway, armed with whatever protection I can gather, trusting that courage and community and small acts of ritual care create their own kind of safety, their own kind of magic, their own sufficient defense against the darkness. Sleep now. The brides are all safe in their marriages or safe in their graves, protected or unprotected, but at peace either way. Their stories told, their garlic finally set down after centuries of carrying. Sleep, and let the pungent smell of ancient weddings fade into the gentler sense of rest and dreams, where no protection is needed because no threat can reach you, where transition is just the soft movement from waking into sleep, and where the only garlic that matters is the memory of garlic, the idea of protection, the comforting knowledge that humans have always tried to shield each other through dangerous passages, and that trying, even with something as humble as garlic, has always been a kind of love, a kind of magic, a kind of protection that works not because it repels demons, but because it strengthens the human heart to face whatever comes, demon or not, with courage, with hope, with the quiet confidence that we're not helpless, we're not alone, and we carry protections our ancestors gave us even when we've forgotten exactly why we carry them. Sweet dreams, sweet dreams, sweet dreams.